So we posted a photo of this koi and asked you a question. Sanke or Showa?
And we got just the responses we were hoping for. Mixed.
Because it can be difficult to tell the difference between the two sometimes, right? I mean, not all the time, not often, but just enough times to be frustrating.
So in this video, we want to share with you the main differences between Sanke and Showa.
We're gonna do like a big picture overview, let's go into the history and see how the bloodlines were developed and how that relates to, their continuous growth. So I hope you're ready for this. Let's go.
Yeah.
So the short answer to the question of what's the difference between a Sanke and Showa is actually quite simple. It's all in the black, otherwise known as the sumi of koi.
So a Showa is a black-based fish that has red and white markings on it. In contrast, a Sanke is a white-based fish that has red and black markings on it.
That's a lot of colors, a lot of confusing, roundabout words. I think if we put this in the context of a quick history lesson, might be a little bit easier to understand.
All right, let's dive in. Of the two varieties, Sanke is much older than Showa.
And this is actually one of my favorite stories because it's really interesting how it developed. So, story goes, two kohaku spawned and produced offspring that had, predictably, red and white patterns. But it also had black markings all over it.
Yeah, it had spots on the bodies and stripes on the fins.
Right? This was not desirable. This was not the plan.
Yep.
So they were considered rejects. However, a guy named Eizaburo Hoshino, during this time, was actively trying to develop new varieties. And he said, I will take those rejects. I will take those rejects and turn them into living jewels.
Yes.
He decided, I will make it bigger and better, and you will love these fish for the thing that which you rejected it for. You will love it, I tell you, you will love it.
Yeah, apparently he was British. His goal was to create a variety that looked like a kohaku, but with arrow feather-like black patches from the shoulder to the tail.
In contrast, we have the Showa, which used to actually compete in the Utsurimono class. To put this in perspective, Showa used to compete against koi that looked like this, and like this, because they used to look like this. Kind of weird, right? Kind of unusual.
Super.
But those are exactly the adjectives that people used when they first saw this Showa.
They didn't even really say they had patterns so much as they just said there are markings on the fish.
But for all the strange things that this koi had, it had one thing going for it. Rich, deep, inky black. So in order to make this variety have some definition to it, you must make these markings an actual pattern.
Yeah.
And they did this by introducing a kohaku.
From this combination, we get the Kobayashi Showa, which is very much the basis of Showa as we know it today. So if I were to tabulate the different black characteristics unique to each variety, it would look something like this. On Sanke, black is a secondary color. It's an accessory to the red pattern. The markings are primarily found on the body of the fish. And in the fins and tail, you'll see stripes of black. This is referred to as tejima. With Showa, black is the primary color, meaning it is the most dominant. You'll see patterns on the head with the black, and on the fins, you'll find what's called motoguro. And that's basically anything that isn't tejima or stripes. So it's usually like blobs of black on the fins.
Now, this list would absolutely work about 90% of the time, right? But what about that 10%? So let's go back to that definition. Sanke is supposed to have black on the body, but if it has black on the head, like this Sanke, or this Sanke, or this Sanke, does that make it no longer a Sanke? And okay, so on the flip side, if Showa is supposed to have black on the head with heavy patterns, does that mean this is not a Showa anymore? And then there's the question of the Motoguro. Showa is supposed to have blobs on its fin, not stripes, anything that doesn't look like stripes, right? But this Showa not only has stripes on its fins, it's also got it on its tail. But why is it still a Showa then?
I've always struggled with the concept of Showa being a black-based koi. And I think a lot of the reason for that is because not all of the fry that are hatched from Showa spawning are black. In fact, a few days after they're hatched, they go through a selection process where only the black ones are kept. And the reason for that is because only those are the ones that develop into Showa. In contrast to that, when Sanke are born or hatched, the fry are all white or like a off yellow kind of like egg yolk color to them. But when you pointed out that only the black fry are kept from a Showa spawning, then the whole idea of Showa being a black-based fish started to click, started to make sense.
Because it's so rare that a single verifiably objective attribute of a koi is so clearly expressed, you know? Because the answer to everything is always, it depends, you know? You never get a straight answer. It's so frustrating. And I remember as a kid growing up watching my dad, anytime I had a question, the answer would about koi. About money, it was always different.
When you ask him for some money, he'd say,
It depends. I'd ask my dad a question about a koi, right? And he'd always give me the same answer. It'd always be like, look at the peach, look at the peach, look at the peach.
look at the fish.
So, okay, check it out. You were an apprentice at Maruto Koi Farm. 3 years long, yeah? What was your koi education like? Did they give you the same look at the fish answer to everything?
I guess. It was,
My dad's gonna kill me.
you were more or less given guidelines as opposed to rules. So it was kind of open to interpretation. A lot of times you were told to kind of like just go with your feeling, like gut feeling, your instinct, especially when it came to like patterned varieties. Sometimes though, your instincts fail you. And when they do, you remember. We were at Izumiya Koi Farm looking for a koi with a very specific trait. Ryu had a couple, so he bowled them up for us to take a look. When I saw the heavy sumi pattern in Motoguro on the first fish, I turned to Mickey and I said, "Cool Showa, huh?" And that's when I heard Ryu say, "Eh? Sanke da yo?" I couldn't believe it. My instincts had failed me. I died a little on the inside.
Oh, wow. So dramatic.
I mean, can you blame me though? Look at this fish. It has Motoguro on its fin and has sumi on its head, all the way down near its mouth. On first glance, it looks exactly like a Showa. But the closer and closer you look at it, it doesn't add up. The sumi isn't quite right for Showa sumi. And then it hit me. If you look at the areas of the sumi where it hasn't fully emerged, you don't see any kage sumi. And that's something we need to explain. Here, we see a Showa where the black hasn't quite fully emerged yet. And when it's in that state of transition, it's kind of got this like shadowy appearance, where the black is strong at the base of each scale, the area where the skin is growing on top of the scale, and in those pockets of skin, it contains melanin. But you can see that deep from inside, the black hasn't quite fully emerged yet. And if you kind of turn the fish, you know, to block the light from penetrating in and showing you the sumi, you can see that it almost disappears. And that's the effect of what we call kage sumi. sumi that's in transition, emerging, developing, coming out from deep within the fish. And this type of sumi has a black or grayish hue to it. And it's unique to Showa, where the sumi can just kind of spring up out of nowhere. In contrast, where if you look at the sumi on Sankei, it's always kind of at the surface, or just below the surface. It doesn't look like it's originating from deep within the fish, but it kind of has this bluish hue to it. And that's the main difference that you can notice between Sankei and Showa when they're in the middle of their development, is that the sumi emergence for Showa is Kage style, and the emergence on Sankei is very much just beneath the surface, and it's much more stable because of this.
So there we have it, the defining feature that clearly delineates Sankei versus Showa. What a terrible definition, huh? I mean, think about it, right? You would have to be a tetrachromat with extra receptors in your eyes that allows you to see the different hues that a black may or may not have. Even then, if the black isn't in a transitory phase, there's no way you're going to see it anyway. So if none of this criteria is consistent, then why do we even have these so-called criteria? What if these traits weren't meant to be a criteria that determines the variety? What if these traits were meant to be a criteria that determines quality? That these traits actually are meant to tell us what it is that we want to have in the variety, but it doesn't have anything to do with determining whether or not it's a valid example of that variety, right? So check it out. There was never a hard and fast rule that said Sankei should never have any sumi on the head. It happens. Conversely, there is no rule that's saying that if a Showa doesn't have black on its head, it can't be called a Showa, because it could have black on its head in the future. So if we've been describing the ideal Sankei or Showa this entire time, we still haven't been able to establish universal identity markers, have we? How can we tell then?
Honestly, the conclusion that I came to is that the only 100% foolproof way is by asking the breeder. They're the ones that select the fish when they're fry, and the process that they go through and the criteria that they're selected by is completely different based on whether it's a Showa or a Sankei.
That's anticlimactic, huh?
There are points in their development where you can tell the difference between the two, but that's subjective to timing, so it's unreliable and inconsistent.
If that's the case then, is being able to tell the difference even relevant to us? I mean, if the best bet that we have is to just ask the breeder, what's the point? Turns out, the point is, it gives us the ability to predict the future.
The very nature of why you would want to know whether this fish is a Showa or a Sankei, because knowing that it is a Showa leads you to expect that this fish is going to develop more black, because it's so unpredictable.
Exactly. And conversely, how many times have we wished a Sankei to have more black than it actually did?
Yeah.
But how often did it actually come?
Very rarely.
Right?
The reason why a Showa doesn't need a strong or balanced heat pattern is because the black base of the fish can negate the need for that. It has the ability to balance the fish out. But whereas a Sankei, because the sumi is really an accessory to the red pattern, you really rely heavily on the red pattern being balanced. So it carries a lot more load. Understanding how koi develop can give you an advantage when selecting them. Studying their development will give you insights into the ways in which they change. And you can use that knowledge to your advantage, because most koi are sold before they're finished. They're still developing. Multiple Grand Champion koi at the All Japan Koi Show were sold at 2 years old.
Some even younger.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I can think of a couple of fish from Dainichi. And then there's that Showa from Maruyama.
I know, right? Tosai. Purchased as a Tosai. All Japan Grand Champion. Story for another time, right?
Yeah.
So we've come to the end of the video.
It's been a long road. This started off as a simple enough idea. You know, how to tell the difference between Sankei and Showa. Can't be that hard, right? But that was weeks ago. Every time we filmed, we stumbled upon, you know, another area that we missed. Like, well, this kind of punches holes in our whole idea of and story of how this is gonna happen and work. I blame it all on Miki. You know? I'm not surprised at all that she managed to overanalyze and overthink this simple concept.
When we decided to make this video, we set out to identify what the real difference between a Sankei and a Showa was, correct?
Yeah.
Turns out the whole difference between the Sankei and the Showa was all about how they develop.
That really comes down to because Sumi is the most dynamic attribute that Koi have. It's exciting, it's maddening, keeps you on your toes, and it keeps things interesting. And once you begin to recognize just how differently it behaves given on which variety it's presenting on, it really takes the experience to a whole nother level. You go from blindly gambling to counting cards. And you're better able to visualize which Koi have the best potential future.
That said, understanding the difference between a Sankei and a Showa isn't a prerequisite of the hobby. I mean, you don't need to know the difference in order to appreciate the beauty of Koi, right?
It is true. Whether or not you can count cards, you can still enjoy playing blackjack, right?
But here's the thing. Why not beat the house? Sorry.
Wow.
That's a one sentence, come on. One sentence!
Why?
One sentence! Go.